The Autobiography of Goethe, Volume 1, by Johann von Goethe, translated by John Oxenford, Section 23. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Autobiography of Goethe, Volume 1, by Johann von Goethe, Section 23. Seventh Book, Part 2. During this intercourse I perceived, through conversation, through examples, and through my own reflections, that the first step in delivering ourselves from the wishy-washy, long-winded, empty epoch could be taken only by definiteness, precision, and brevity. In the style which had hitherto prevailed, one could not distinguish the commonplace from what was better, since all were brought down to a level with each other. Authors had already tried to escape from this widespread disease with more or less success. Haller and Ramler were inclined to compression by nature. Lessing and Wieland were led to it by reflection. The former became by degrees quite epigrammatical in his poems, terse in Minna, laconic in Emilia Galotti. It was not till afterwards that he returned to that serene naivete which becomes him so well in Nathan. Wieland, who had been occasionally prolix in Agathon, Don Silvio, and the comic tales, becomes condensed and precise to a wonderful degree, as well as exceedingly graceful, in Musarion and Idris. Klopstock, in the first cantos of the Messiah, is not without diffuseness. In his odes and other minor poems he appears compressed, as also in his tragedies. By his emulation of the ancients, especially Tacitus, he sees himself constantly forced into narrower limits, by which he at last becomes obscure and unpalatable. Gerstenberg, a fine but eccentric talent, also distinguishes himself. His merit is appreciated, but on the whole he gives little pleasure. Gleim, diffuse and easy by nature, is scarcely once concise in his war songs. Ramler is properly more a critic than a poet. He begins to collect what the Germans have accomplished in lyric poetry. He now finds that scarcely one poem fully satisfies him. He must leave out, arrange, and alter, that the things may have some shape or other. By this means he makes himself almost as many enemies as there are poets and amateurs, since everyone, properly speaking, recognizes himself only in his defects, and the public interests itself sooner for a faulty individuality than for that which is produced or amended according to a universal law of taste. Rhythm lay yet in the cradle, and no one knew of a method to shorten its childhood. Poetical prose came into the ascendant. Gessner and Klopstock excited many imitators. Others again still demanded an intelligible metre, and translated this prose into rhythm. But even these gave nobody satisfaction, for they were obliged to omit and add, and the prose original always passed for the better of the two. But the more with all this conciseness is aimed at, the more does a judgment become possible, since that which is important, being more closely compressed, allows a certain comparison at last. It happened also at the same time that many kinds of truly poetical forms arose, for as they tried to represent only what was necessary in the objects they wished to imitate, they were forced to do justice to every one of these, and in this manner, though no one did it consciously, the modes of representation multiplied themselves, among which indeed were some which were really caricatures, while many an attempt proved unsuccessful. Without question, Wieland possessed the finest natural gifts of all. He had early cultivated himself thoroughly in those ideal regions where youth so readily lingers. But when, by what is called experience, by the events of the world and women, these were rendered distasteful to him, he threw himself on the side of the actual, and pleased himself and others with the contest of the two worlds, where, in light skirmishing between jest and earnest, his talent displayed itself most beautifully. How many of his brilliant productions fall into the time of my academic years! Musarion had the most effect upon me, and I can yet remember the place and the very spot where I got sight of the first proof sheet which Goethe gave me. Here it was that I believed I saw antiquity again living and fresh. Everything that is plastic in Wieland's genius here showed itself in its highest perfection, and when that Fannius Timon, condemned to an unhappy insipidity, finally reconciles himself to his mistress and to the world, one can well with him live through the misanthropical epoch. For the rest, we readily conceded to these works a cheerful aversion from those exalted sentiments which, by reason of their easy misapplication to life, are often open to the suspicion of dreaminess. We pardoned the author for prosecuting with ridicule what we held as true and reverend, the more readily as he thereby gave us to understand that it caused him continual trouble. How miserably criticism then received such labours may be seen from the first volumes of the Universal German Library. Of the comic tales there is honourable mention, but there is no trace of any insight into the character of the kind of poetry. The reviewer, like everyone at that time, had formed his taste by examples. He never takes it into consideration that, in a judgment of such parodistical works, one must first of all have before one's eyes the original, noble, beautiful object, in order to see whether the parodist has really gotten from it a weak and comical side, whether he has borrowed anything from it, or, under the appearance of such an imitation, has perhaps given us an excellent invention of his own. Of all this there is not a notion, but the poems are praised and blamed by passages. The reviewer, as he himself confesses, has marked so much that pleased him that he cannot quote it all in print. When they even meet the highly meritorious translation of Shakespeare with the exclamation, "By rights, a man like Shakespeare should not have been translated at all," it will be understood without further remark how infinitely the Universal German Library was behindhand in matters of taste, and that young people, animated by true feeling, had to look about them for other guiding stars. The material which in this manner more or less determined the form, the Germans sought everywhere. They had handled few national subjects, or none at all. Schlegel's Hermann only showed the way. The idyllic tendency extended itself without end. The want of distinctive character with Gessner, with all his great gracefulness and childlike heartiness, made everyone think that he could do something of the same kind. Just in the same manner, out of the more generally human, some snatch those poems which should have portrayed a foreign nationality, as, for instance, the Jewish pastoral poems, those on the patriarchs altogether, and whatever else related to the Old Testament. Bodmer's Noachide was a perfect symbol of the watery deluge that swelled high around the German Parnassus, and which abated but slowly. The leading strings of Anacreon likewise allowed innumerable mediocre geniuses to reel about at large. The precision of Horace compelled the Germans, though but slowly, to conform to him. Comic heroic poems, mostly after the model of Pope's Rape of the Lock, did not serve to bring in a better time. I must here mention a delusion which operated as seriously as it must be ridiculous when one examines it more closely. The Germans had now sufficient historical knowledge of all the kinds of poetry in which the different nations had distinguished themselves. This pigeonhole work, which, properly speaking, totally destroys the inner conception of poetry, had been already pretty completely hammered together by Gottsched in his critical art of poetry, and it had been shown at the same time that German poets too had already known how to fill up all the rubrics with excellent works. And thus it ever went on. Each year the collection was more considerable, but every year one work pushed another out of the place in which it had hitherto shone. We now possessed, if not Homer's, yet Virgil's and Milton's; if not a Pindar, yet a Horace. Of Theocritus's there was no lack, and thus they weighed themselves by comparisons from without, whilst the mass of poetical works always increased, so that at last there could be a comparison from within. Now, though matters of taste stood on a very uncertain footing, there could be no dispute but that within the Protestant part of Germany and of Switzerland, what is generally called common sense began to stir briskly at that epoch. The scholastic philosophy, which always has the merit of propounding according to received axioms, in a favourite order and under fixed rubrics, everything about which man can at all inquire, had, by the frequent darkness and apparent uselessness of its subject matter, by its unseasonable application of a method in itself respectable, and by its too great extension over so many subjects, made itself foreign to the mass, unpalatable, and at last superfluous. Many a one became convinced that nature had endowed him with as great a portion of good and straightforward sense as perchance he required to form such a clear notion of objects that he could manage them and turn them to his own profit and that of others, without laboriously troubling himself about the most universal problems, and inquiring how the most remote things, which do not particularly affect us, may hang together. Men made the trial, opened their eyes, looked straight before them, observant, industrious, active, and believed that when one judges and acts correctly in one's own circle, one may well presume to speak of other things also, which lie at a greater distance. In accordance with such a notion, every one was now entitled not only to philosophize, but also by degrees to consider himself a philosopher. Philosophy, therefore, was more or less sound and practised common sense, which ventured to enter upon the universal and to decide upon inner and outer experiences. A clear-sighted acuteness and an especial moderation, while the middle path and fairness to all opinions was held to be right, procured respect and confidence for writings and oral statements of the sort, and thus at last philosophers were found in all the faculties, nay, in all classes and trades. In this way the theologians could not help inclining to what is called natural religion, and when the discussion was how far the light of nature may suffice to advance us in the knowledge of God and the improving and ennobling of ourselves, they commonly ventured to decide in its favour without much scruple. According to the same principle of moderation, They then granted equal rights to all the positive religions, by which they all became alike indifferent and uncertain. For the rest, they let everything stand. And since the Bible is so full of matter that, more than any other book, it offers material for reflection and opportunity for meditation on human affairs, it could still, as before, be always laid as the foundation of all sermons and other religious treatises. But over this work, as well as over the whole body of profane writers, was impending a singular fate, which in the lapse of time was not to be averted. Hitherto it had been received as a matter of implicit faith that this book of books was composed in one spirit, that it was even inspired and, as it were, dictated by the divine Spirit. Yet for a long time already the discrepancies of the different parts of it had been now cavilled at, now apologized for, by believers and unbelievers. English, French, and Germans had attacked the Bible with more or less violence, acuteness, audacity, and wantonness, and just as often had it been taken under the protection of earnest, sound-thinking men of each nation. As for myself, I loved and valued it, for almost to it alone did I owe my moral culture, and the events, the doctrines, the symbols, the similes, had all impressed themselves deeply upon me, and had influenced me in one way or another. These unjust, scoffing, and perverting attacks therefore disgusted me. But people had already gone so far as very willingly to admit, partly as a main ground for the defence of many passages, that God had accommodated himself to the modes of thought and power of comprehension in men, that even those moved by the Spirit had not on that account been able to renounce their character, their individuality, and that Amos, a cowherd, did not use the language of Isaiah, who is said to have been a prince. Out of such views and convictions, especially with a constantly increasing knowledge of languages, was very naturally developed that kind of study by which it was attempted to examine more accurately the Oriental localities, nationalities, natural products, and phenomena, and in this manner to make present to oneself that ancient time. Michaelis employed the whole strength of his talents and his knowledge on this side. Descriptions of travels became a powerful help in explaining the Holy Scriptures, and later travellers, furnished with numerous questions, were made, by the answers to them, to bear witness for the prophets and apostles. But whilst they were on all sides busied to bring the Holy Scriptures to a natural intuition, and to render peculiar modes of thought and representation in them more universally comprehensible, that by this historico-critical aspect many an objection might be removed, many offensive things effaced, and many a shallow scoffing be made ineffective, there appeared in some men just the opposite disposition, since these chose the darkest, most mysterious writings as the subject of their meditations, and wished, if not to elucidate them, yet to confirm them through internal evidence by means of conjectures, calculations, and other ingenious and strange combinations, and so far as they contained prophecies, to prove them by the results, and thus to justify a faith in what was next to be expected. The Venerable Bengal had procured a decided reception for his labours on the revelation of St. John, from the fact that he was known as an intelligent, upright, God-fearing, blameless man. Deep minds are compelled to live in the past as well as in the future. The ordinary movements of the world can be of no importance to them if they do not, in the course of ages up to the present, revere prophecies which have been revealed, and in the immediate as well as in the most remote futurity, predictions still veiled. Hence arises a connection that is wanting in history, which seems to give us only an accidental wavering backwards and forwards in a necessary limited circle. Dr. Crusius was one of those whom the prophetic part of Scripture suited more than any other, since it brings into action the two most opposite qualities of human nature, the affections and the acuteness of the intellect. Many young men had devoted themselves to this doctrine, and already formed a respectable body, which attracted the more attention, as Ernesti, with his friends, threatened not to illuminate, but completely to disperse the obscurity in which these delighted. Hence arose controversies, hatred, persecution, and much that was unpleasant. I attached myself to the lucid party, and sought to appropriate to myself their principles and advantages, although I ventured to forebode that by this extremely praiseworthy, intelligent method of interpretation, the poetic contents of the writings must at last be lost, along with the prophetical. But those who devoted themselves to German literature and the belles lettres were more nearly concerned with the efforts of such men who, as Jerusalem, Zollikofer, and Spalding, tried, by means of a good and pure style in their sermons and treatises, to gain, even among persons of a certain degree of sense and taste, applause and attachment for religion, and for the moral philosophy which is so closely related to it. A pleasing manner of writing began to be necessary everywhere. And since such a manner must above all be comprehensible, so did writers arise on many sides who undertook to write about their studies and their professions, clearly, perspicuously, and impressively, and as well for the adepts as for the multitude. After the example of Tissot, a foreigner, the physicians also now began to labour zealously for the general cultivation. Haller, Unzer, Zimmermann had a very great influence, and whatever may be said against them in detail, especially the last, they produced a very great effect in their time. And mention should be made of this in history, but particularly in biography. For a man remains of consequence not so far as he leaves something behind him, but so far as he acts and enjoys, and rouses others to action and enjoyment. The jurists, accustomed from their youth upward to an abstruse style, which in all legal papers, from the petty court of the immediate knight up to the imperial diet at Ratisbon, was still maintained in all its quaintness, could not easily elevate themselves to a certain freedom, the less so as the subjects of which they had to treat were most intimately connected with the external form, and consequently also with the style. But the younger von Moser had already shown himself an independent and original writer, and Putter, by the clearness of his delivery, had also brought clearness into his subject and the style in which he was to treat it. All that proceeded from his school was distinguished by this, and even the philosophers, in order to be popular, now found themselves compelled to write clearly and intelligibly. Mendelssohn and Garve appeared and excited universal interest and admiration. With the cultivation of the German language and style in every department, the capacity for forming a judgment also increased, and we admire the reviews then published of works upon religious and moral as well as medical subjects, while, on the contrary, we remark that the judgments of poems and of whatever else may relate to the belles lettres will be found, if not pitiful, at least very feeble. This holds good of the literary epistles, Literaturbriefen, and of the Universal German Library, as well as of the Library of the Belles Lettres, notable instances of which could easily be produced. No matter in how motley a manner, all this might be confused still, for every one who contemplated producing anything from himself, who would not merely take the words and phrases out of the mouths of his predecessors, there was nothing further left but, early and late, to look about him for some subject matter which he might determine to use. Here, too, we were much led astray. People were constantly repeating a saying of Kleist, which we had to hear often enough. He had sportively, ingeniously, and truly replied to those who took him to task on account of his frequent lonely walks, that he was not idle at such times, he was going to the image hunt. This simile was very suitable for a nobleman and soldier, who by it placed himself in contrast with the men of his rank, who did not neglect going out with their guns on their shoulders, hare hunting and partridge shooting as often as an opportunity presented itself. Hence we find in Kleist's poems many such individual images, happily seized, though not always happily elaborated, which in a kindly manner remind us of nature. But now they also recommended us quite seriously to go out on the image hunt, which did not at last leave us wholly without fruit, although Appel's garden, the kitchen gardens, the Rosenthal, Golis, Raschwitz, and Konnewitz would be the oddest ground to beat up poetical game in. And yet I was often induced by that motive to contrive that my walk should be solitary, and because many objects, neither beautiful nor sublime, met the eye of the beholder, and in the truly splendid Rosenthal, the gnats in the best season of the year allowed no tender thoughts to arise, so did I, by unwearied persevering endeavour, become extremely attentive to the small life of nature. I would use this word after the analogy of still life. And since the pretty events which one perceives within this circle represent but little in themselves, so I accustomed myself to see in them a significance which inclined now towards the symbolical, now towards the allegorical side, accordingly as intuition, feeling, or reflection had the preponderance. I will relate one incident in place of many. I was, after the fashion of humanity, in love with my name, and, as young uneducated people commonly do, wrote it down everywhere. Once I had carved it very handsomely and accurately on the smooth bark of a linden tree of moderate age. The following autumn, when my affection for Annette was in its fullest bloom, I took the trouble to cut hers above it. Towards the end of the winter, in the meantime, like a capricious lover, I had wantonly sought many opportunities to tease her and to cause her vexation. In the spring I chanced to visit the spot, and the sap, which was rising strongly in the trees, had welled out through the incisions which formed her name, and which were not yet crusted over, and moistened with innocent vegetable tears the already hardened traces of my own. Thus to see her here weeping over me, who had so often called up her tears by my ill conduct, filled me with confusion. At the remembrance of my injustice and of her love, even the tears came into my eyes. I hastened to implore pardon of her doubly and trebly, and I turned this incident into an idyll, (Footnote: Die Laune des Verliebten, translated as The Lover's Caprice, see page 241, which I never could read to myself without affection, or to others without emotion. while I now, like a shepherd on the Pleiße, was absorbed childishly enough in such tender subjects, and always chose only such as I could easily recall into my bosom, provision from a greater and more important side had long been made for German poets. The first true and really vital material of the higher order came into German poetry through Frederick the Great and the deeds of the 7 Years' War. All national poetry must be shallow, or become shallow, which does not rest on that which is most universally human, upon the events of nations and their shepherds, when both stand for one man. Kings are to be represented in war and danger, where by that very means they appear as the first, because they determine and share the fate of the very least, and thus become much more interesting than the gods themselves, who, when they have once determined the fates, withdraw from all participation in them. In this view of the subject, every nation, if it will be worth anything at all, must possess an epopee, to which the precise form of the epic poem is not necessary. The war songs, started by Gleim, maintain so high a rank among German poems, because they arose with and in the achievements which are their subject, and because, moreover, their felicitous form, just as if a fellow combatant had produced them in the loftiest moments, makes us feel the most complete effectiveness. Ramler sings the deeds of his king in a different and most noble manner. All his poems are full of matter, and occupy us with great heart-elevating objects, and thus already maintain an indestructible value. For the internal matter of the subject treated is the beginning and end of art. It will not indeed be denied that genius, that thoroughly cultivated artistical talent, can make everything out of everything by its method of treatment, and can subdue the most refractory material, but when closely examined, the result is rather a trick of art than a work of art, which should rest upon a worthy object, that the treatment of it by skill, pains, and industry may present to us the dignity of the subject matter, only the more happily and splendidly. The Prussians, and with them Protestant Germany, acquired thus for their literature a treasure which the opposite party lacked, and the want of which they have been able to supply by no subsequent endeavours. Upon the great idea which the Prussian writers might well entertain of their king, they first established themselves, and the more zealously as he in whose name they did it all wished once for all to know nothing about them. Already before this, through the French colony, afterwards through the king's predilection for the literature of that nation and for their financial institutions, had a mass of French civilization come into Prussia, which was highly advantageous to the Germans, since by it they were challenged to contradiction and resistance. Thus the very aversion of Frederick from German was a fortunate thing for the formation of its literary character. They did everything to attract the king's attention, not indeed to be honoured, but only noticed by him. Yet they did it in the German fashion, from an internal conviction. They did what they held to be right, and desired and wished that the king should recognize and prize this German uprightness. That did not and could not happen. For how can it be required of a king who wishes to live and enjoy himself intellectually, that he shall lose his years in order to see what he thinks barbarous developed and rendered palatable too late? In matters of trade and manufacture he might indeed force upon himself, but especially upon his people, very moderate substitutes instead of excellent foreign wares. But here everything comes to perfection more rapidly, and it needs not a man's lifetime to bring such things to maturity. But I must here first of all make honourable mention of one work, the most genuine production of the 7 Years' War, and of perfect North German nationality. It is the first theatrical production caught from the important events of life, one of specific temporary value, and one which therefore produced an incalculable effect. Minna von Barnhelm. Lessing, who, in opposition to Klopstock and Gleim, was fond of casting off his personal dignity, because he was confident that he could at any moment grasp and take it up again, delighted in a dissipated life in taverns and the world, as he always needed a strong counterpoise to his powerfully labouring interior. And for this reason also he had joined the suite of General Tauentzien. One easily discovers how the above-mentioned piece was generated betwixt war and peace, hatred and affection. It was this production which happily opened the view into a higher, more significant world from the literary and citizen world in which poetic art had hitherto moved. The intense hatred in which the Prussians and Saxons stood towards each other during this war could not be removed by its termination. The Saxon now first felt with true bitterness the wounds which the upstart Prussian had inflicted upon him. Political peace could not immediately re-establish a peace between their dispositions, but this was to be brought about symbolically by the above-mentioned drama. The grace and amiability of the Saxon ladies conquer the worth, the dignity, the stubbornness of the Prussians, and in the principal as well as in the subordinate characters a happy union of bizarre and contradictory elements is artistically represented. If I have put my reader in some perplexity by these cursory and desultory remarks on German literature, I have succeeded in giving them a conception of that chaotic condition in which my poor brain found itself when, in the conflict of two epochs so important for the literary fatherland, so much that was new crowded in upon me before I could come to terms with the old, so much that was old yet made me feel its right over me, when I believed I had already cause to venture on renouncing it altogether. I will at present try to impart as well as possible the way I entered on to extricate myself from this difficulty, if only step by step. The period of prolixity into which my youth had fallen, I had laboured through with genuine industry, in company with so many worthy men. The numerous quarto volumes of manuscript which I left behind with my father might serve for sufficient witnesses of this, and what a mass of essays, rough drafts, and half-executed designs had, more from despondency than conviction, gone up in smoke. Now, through conversation, through instruction in general, through so many conflicting opinions, but especially through my fellow boarder, Hofrath Pfeil, I learned to value more and more the importance of the subject matter and the conciseness of the treatment, without, however, being able to make it clear to myself where the former was to be sought, or how the latter was to be attained. For what with the great narrowness of my situation, what with the indifference of my companions, the reserve of the professors, the exclusiveness of the educated inhabitants, and what with the perfect insignificance of the natural objects, I was compelled to seek for everything within myself. Whenever I desired a true basis in feeling or reflection for my poems, I was forced to grasp into my own bosom. Whenever I required for my poetic representation an immediate intuition of an object or an event, I could not step outside the circle which was fitted to teach me and inspire me with an interest. In this view I wrote at first certain little poems in the form of songs, or in a freer measure. They are founded on reflection, treat of the past, and for the most part take an epigrammatic turn. And thus began that tendency from which I could not deviate my whole life through, namely, the tendency to turn into an image, into a poem, everything that delighted or troubled me, or otherwise occupied me, and to come to some certain understanding with myself upon it, that I might both rectify my conceptions of external things and set my mind at rest about them. The faculty of doing this was necessary to no one more than to me, for my natural disposition whirled me constantly from one extreme to the other. All, therefore, that has been confessed by me consists of fragments of a great confession, and this little book is an attempt which I have ventured on to render it complete. My early affection for Gretchen I had now transferred to one Annette Aennchen, of whom I can say nothing more than that she was young, handsome, sprightly, loving, and so agreeable that she well deserved to be set up for a time in the shrine of the heart as a little saint, that she might receive all that reverence which it often causes more pleasure to bestow than to receive. I saw her daily without hindrance. She helped to prepare the meals I enjoyed. She brought in the evening, at least, the wine I drank. And indeed our select club of noonday boarders was a warranty that the little house, which was visited by few guests except during the fair, well merited its good reputation. Opportunity and inclination were found for various kinds of amusement, but as she neither could nor dared go much out of the house, the pastime was somewhat limited. We sang the songs of Zachariah, played the Duke Michael of Kruger, in which a knotted handkerchief had to take the place of the nightingale, and so for a while it went on quite tolerably. But since such connections, the more innocent they are, afford the less variety in the long run, I was seized with that wicked distemper which seduces us to derive amusement from the torment of a beloved one, and to domineer over a girl's devotedness with a wanton and tyrannical caprice. My ill humour at the failure of my poetical attempts, at the apparent impossibility of coming to a clear understanding about them, and at everything else that might pinch me here and there, I thought I might vent on her, because she truly loved me with all her heart, and did whatever she could to please me. By unfounded and absurd fits of jealousy, I destroyed our most delightful days, both for myself and her. She endured it for a time with incredible patience, which I was cruel enough to try to the uttermost. But to my shame and despair, I was at last forced to remark that her heart was alienated from me, and that I might now have good ground for the madness in which I had indulged without necessity and without cause. There were also terrible scenes between us in which I gained nothing, and I then first felt that I had truly loved her, and could not bear to lose her. My passion grew and assumed all the forms of which it is capable under such circumstances. Nay, at last I even took up the rôle which the girl had hitherto played. I sought everything possible in order to be agreeable to her, even to procure her pleasure by means of others, for I could not renounce the hope of winning her again. But it was too late. I had lost her really, and the frenzy with which I revenged my fault upon myself by assaulting in various frantic ways my physical nature, in order to inflict some hurt on my moral nature, contributed very much to the bodily maladies under which I lost some of the best years of my life. Indeed, I should perchance have been completely ruined by this loss, had not my poetic talent here shown itself particularly helpful with its healing power. Already, at many intervals before, I had clearly enough perceived my ill conduct. I really pitied the poor child when I saw her so thoroughly wounded by me without necessity. I pictured to myself so often and so circumstantially her condition and my own, and, as a contrast, the contented state of another couple in our company, that at last I could not forbear treating this situation dramatically, as a painful and instructive penance. Hence arose the oldest of my extant dramatic labours, the little piece entitled Die Laune des Verliebten, the lover's caprice, in the simple nature of which one may at the same time perceive the impetus of a boiling passion. But before this, a deep, significant, impulsive world had already interested me. Through my adventures with Gretchen and its consequences, I had early looked into the strange labyrinths by which civil society is undermined. Religion, morals, law, rank, connections, custom, all rule only the surface of city existence. The streets, bordered by splendid houses, are kept neat, and every one behaves himself there properly enough. But indoors it often seems only so much the more disordered, and a smooth exterior, like a thin coat of mortar, plasters over many a rotten wall that tumbles together overnight, and produces an effect the more frightful as it comes into the midst of a condition of repose. A great many families, far and near, I had seen already, either overwhelmed in ruin, or kept miserably hanging on the brink of it by means of bankruptcies, divorces, seduced daughters, murders, house robberies, poisonings. And young as I was, I had often in such cases lent a hand for help and preservation. For as my frankness awakened confidence, as my secrecy was proved, as my activity feared no sacrifice, and loved best to exert itself in the most dangerous affairs, I had often enough found opportunity to mediate, to hush up, to divert the lightning flash, with every other assistance of the kind, in the course of which, as well in my own person as through others, I could not fail to come to the knowledge of many afflicting and humiliating facts. To relieve myself, I designed several plays and wrote the arguments. * Exposition, in a dramatic sense, properly means a statement of the events which take place before the action of the play commences. Translator. Of most of them. But since the intrigues were always obliged to be painful, and almost all these pieces threatened a tragical conclusion, I let them drop one after another. Die Mitschuldigen, the accomplices, is the only one that was finished, the cheerful and burlesque tone of which, upon the gloomy family ground, appears as if accompanied by something causing anxiety, so that on the whole it is painful in representation, although it pleases in detached passages. The illegal deeds, harshly expressed, wound the aesthetic and moral feeling, and the piece could therefore find no favour on the German stage, although the imitations of it, which steered clear of those rocks, were received with applause. Both the above-mentioned pieces were, however, written from a more elevated point of view, without my having been aware of it. They direct us to a considerate forbearance in casting moral imputations, and, in somewhat harsh and coarse touches, sportively express that most Christian maxim, "Let him who is without sin among you cast the first stone." Through this earnestness, which cast a gloom over my first pieces, I committed the mistake of neglecting very favourable materials, which lay quite decidedly in my natural disposition. In the midst of these serious and, for a young man, fearful experiences, was developed in me a reckless humour, which feels itself superior to the moment, and not only fears no danger, but rather wantonly courts it. The reason of this lay in the exuberance of spirits in which the vigorous time of life so much delights, and which, if it manifests itself in a frolicsome way, causes much pleasure, both at the moment and in remembrance. These things are so usual that in the vocabulary of our young university friends they are called sweets, and on account of the close similarity of signification, to play sweets means just the same as to play pranks. The real meaning of the passage is that the idiom Possenreissen is used also with the university word sweet, so that one can say Sweetenreissen, translator. Such humorous acts of daring, brought on the theatre with wit and sense, are of the greatest effect. They are distinguished from intrigue, inasmuch as they are momentary, and that their aim, whenever they are to have one, must not be remote. Beaumarchais has seized their full value, and the effects of his Figaro spring preeminently from this. Whereas such good-humoured, roguish, and half-knavish pranks are practised with personal risk for noble ends, the situations which arise from them are aesthetically and morally considered of the greatest value for the theatre, as, for instance, the opera of the Water Carrier treats perhaps the happiest subject which we have ever yet seen upon the stage. To enliven the extreme tedium of daily life, I played off numberless tricks of the sort, partly without any aim at all, partly in the service of my friends, whom I liked to please. For myself, I could not say that I had once acted in this designedly, nor that I ever happened to consider a feat of the kind as a subject for art. Had I, however, seized upon and elaborated such materials, which were so close at hand, my earliest labours would have been more cheerful and available. Some incidents of this kind occur indeed later, but isolated and without design. For since the heart always lies nearer to us than the head, and gives us trouble, whereas the latter knows how to set matters to rights, the affairs of the heart had always appeared to me as the most important. I was never weary of reflecting upon the transient nature of attachments, the mutability of human character, moral sensuality, and all the heights and depths, the combination of which in our nature may be considered as the riddle of human life. Here too I sought to get rid of that which troubled me in a song, an epigram, in some kind of rhyme, which, since they referred to the most private feelings and the most peculiar circumstances, could scarcely interest any one but myself. In the meantime, my external position had very much changed after the lapse of a short time. Madame Bohme, after a long and melancholy illness, had at last died. She had latterly ceased to admit me to her presence. Her husband could not be very much satisfied with me. I seemed to him not sufficiently industrious and too frivolous. He especially took it very ill of me when it was told him that at the lectures on German public law, instead of taking proper notes, I had been drawing on the margin of my notebook the personages presented to our notice in them, such as the president of the chamber, the moderators and assessors, in strange wigs, and by this drollery had disturbed my attentive neighbours and set them laughing. After the loss of his wife, he lived still more retired than before, and at last I shunned him in order to avoid his reproaches. But it was peculiarly unfortunate that Gellert would not use the power which he might have exercised over us. Indeed, he had not time to play the father confessor, and to inquire after the character and faults of everybody. He therefore took the matter very much in the lump, and thought to curb us by means of the church forms. For this reason he commonly, when he admitted us to his presence, used to lower his little head, and in his weeping, winning voice to ask us whether we went regularly to church, who was our confessor, and whether we took the Holy Communion. If we came off badly at this examination, we were dismissed with lamentations. We were more vexed than edified, yet could not help loving the man heartily. End of section 23.